On December 13th, 1982, 19-year-old David Thies and his family were gathered in their Manhattan apartment to honor his father's birthday. David had been acting strangely all afternoon, nervously flipping through TV news channels as if he were searching for or frightened by something he saw. His mother, Karen, later recalled her son seemed petrified with an inexplicable fear during this period. The festive mood in the apartment quickly turned uneasy, but no one imagined it would be the last time they'd see David. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, David stepped out into the hallway for a quick smoke break, telling his family he'd be right back. He never returned. In a matter of minutes, an ordinary afternoon transformed into every parent's nightmare as David Thies vanished without a trace. When David failed to come back inside after puffing on his cancer kazoo, his mother knew immediately that something was wrong. It was completely unlike him to wander off, especially in the middle of preparing a birthday dinner for his father. In fact, earlier that day, David had gone out to buy a gift for his dad and had even planned to help make a salad for the celebratory meal. For him to simply disappear during what should have been a happy family occasion was baffling and alarming. Karen stepped into the hallway expecting to find David lingering, but he was gone. As minutes ticked by with no sign of her son, panic set in. The family searched their apartment building and then the surrounding block, calling David's name and asking neighbors if they'd seen the tall, lanky teenager, but no one had. Desperate, his parents contacted the police, and a full-scale search was launched. Officers and volunteers scoured Manhattan for any clue of David's whereabouts, checking hospitals, shelters, and even morgues. Despite these efforts, the initial search turned up nothing. No witnesses, no accident reports, and no hints of where David might have gone. The lack of any evidence or sightings in those crucial first hours was bewildering to authorities. Friends and family were at a loss to explain the sudden disappearance. David was legally an adult at 19, but he still lived at home and hadn't mentioned any plans to leave or travel. He had left behind everything in his room undisturbed. There was no farewell note and no indication that he intended to be away for long. In fact, because he had stepped out so casually, he hadn't even taken any belongings with him besides the clothes on his back. Manhattan in the early 1980s was quite dangerous, but the idea that a young man could go missing in broad daylight outside his own home was still terrifying. In the wake of David's disappearance, Karen reflected on her son's behavior leading up to that fateful evening. By all accounts, David had been going through a rough patch in the weeks prior. He had battled episodes of depression and anxiety, enough that psychiatric social workers who knew his case warned that David exhibited tendencies against himself. His mother acknowledged that 19-year-old David had been struggling with mental health issues and often seemed emotionally fragile. On the very day he vanished, his behavior had been particularly unusual. As mentioned, he was obsessively watching and switching between news channels on TV, appearing agitated and fearful of something he thought he saw or expected to see. While this does seem to point to a mental health trigger to his disappearance, investigators noted that there was no evidence that David took any actions against himself. Even more chilling was a revelation that came out a few months after the disappearance. In May 1983, Karen shared with a reporter that David had allegedly received threats in the period leading up to his disappearance. David didn't specify who made these threats or why, but this detail cast a new and frightening light on David's mindset. Karen unfortunately doesn't appear to have dug deep, or David wasn't willing to explain, but at any rate, the nature of these forces is unknown. If David truly believed someone wanted to harm him, it might explain his palpable fear that day. Karen even expressed a belief that her son may have been abducted by a religious cult against his will. While this belief may seem like a mother attempting to cope with the harsh reality of what actually happened to her son, there was evidence to suggest this was the case. Tips began flooding in, not from New York, but from California. In the months following David's disappearance, more than 40 people contacted New York police, claiming they had seen someone matching David's description out in California. The tips indicated that he was selling trinkets on street corners and that he was spotted in the company of a group that was described as cult-like. Investigators followed up on these California sightings as best they could. They coordinated with California authorities, checked shelters and street hangouts, and tried to track down the mysterious cult rumors. Unfortunately, none of these leads were ever substantiated, and the case once again went cold, and years passed with no solid information. Then, around 1985, roughly 3 years after David's disappearance, a new glimmer of hope emerged. Several tips came in claiming that David, or someone who resembled him, was back in New York City, possibly staying in a Manhattan homeless shelter. The cops canvassed the shelters, but ultimately were unable to find this man who allegedly matched David's description. The question of what happened to David has led to substantial speculation over the years, and several theories have been debated by investigators and armchair sleuths alike. One theory is that David ran away intentionally. This idea is bolstered by his known emotional troubles. It's conceivable that David chose to flee to escape his problems, whether those were internal or external. Some have speculated that his belief that there were threats against him may have simply been a manifestation of his worsening mental state. If he fled of his own accord, the sightings in California and later in New York might actually have been him living off the grid. People who subscribe to this theory think David could have assumed a transient lifestyle to hide from whatever demons were chasing him, whether they were real or imagined. Perhaps he hitchhiked across the country, dropped his former identity, and survived by panhandling or doing odd jobs. The fact that none of the sightings were confirmed means we can't know for sure if they were real or mistaken. That said, they leave the door open that David might have left to start a new life, or simply to get away. If he believed that there were people threatening him, he may have believed he was actually saving his family by dropping off the radar like he did. If this scenario is accurate, David might still be out there today. Another prominent theory centers on the idea of cult involvement or abduction. The notion that David fell prey to a cult has been fueled by multiple pieces of circumstantial evidence. First, the numerous tips about seeing him with a cult group in California suggest that at least some people thought he was in the orbit of a religious or fringe group. Second, David's own mother voiced her belief that a cult could have been responsible, going so far as to suspect he was abducted into such a group against his will. If David had encountered a cult in New York, it's possible he got entangled and was either brainwashed or coerced to leave his old life. Cults have targeted vulnerable young people since the dawn of time, and David being depressed and anxious definitely fit the bill. A third possibility that must be considered is foul play unrelated to a cult, essentially that David met with some kind of crime or accident after stepping out. New York City in 1982 had its share of crime, to say the least, and it's conceivable that David could have stepped outside at the wrong moment. Perhaps he witnessed something he shouldn't have, or crossed paths with a dangerous person on the street. The fact that he was never heard from again could imply that someone harmed him that very day and concealed his body. However, as of now, no forensic evidence has tied any John Doe to David, and there's no evidence that he met with foul play regardless. Finally, some have wondered if David experienced some form of psychological break or amnesia that caused him to lose touch with who he was. In this scenario, David might not have intended to disappear, but became disoriented due to a mental health crisis. He could have wandered away in a dissociative state and not known how to get home or who to call. If his memory or sense of self was impaired, he may have ended up living homeless under a different name, not realizing a whole city and family were searching for him. This is speculative, but cases of dissociative fugue have been documented, and some people actually find that they enjoy their new fugue life more. Given that David was suffering from depression in his regular life, it could be that he decided to just continue on with living his new life. Over 40 years later, the disappearance of David Thies remains an open and agonizing mystery. As of today, David Thies would be in his early 60s, a far cry from the teenager who disappeared in 1982. It was a late October night in 2021 when 37-year-old Melissa Trumpy walked out of her workplace in Monroe, Wisconsin, and into the chilly darkness, never to return. Her disappearance quickly became a haunting mystery involving two states, a troubled romance, and a community desperately seeking answers. Melissa's life in the months before she went missing was tumultuous. She had started dating 35-year-old Derek Hammer in 2019, and friends say the relationship was toxic from the start. Hammer had a history of violence and crime, and he'd even served prison time in Nevada for the assault of a former girlfriend. Once he came into Melissa's life, family noticed negative changes. Melissa, who had no criminal record before, became entangled in Hammer's alleged substance activities. Hammer's influence was so consuming that Melissa's eldest daughter ended up taking on the role of caregiver for her younger siblings. In a frightening September 2021 incident, Melissa's kids witnessed Hammer pointing a weapon at her during an argument. Police were alerted, and Hammer was arrested and charged, while Melissa herself was briefly arrested for minor substance-related charges. A court then ordered Hammer to have no contact with Melissa as the legal case against him moved forward. Melissa was reportedly cooperating with police as a witness against her boyfriend in his pending cases, and everything seemed to be coming to a head as October 2021 arrived. On October 26, 2021, Melissa worked her evening shift and left around 10:30 p.m. with plans to see Derek Hammer despite the no-contact order. She headed toward Shannon, Illinois, a tiny town across the state line where Hammer was staying at his mother's home. Multiple witnesses later confirmed that Melissa did make it to Shannon and was with Hammer at a residence there that night. That evening was the last time anyone saw her. When she failed to show up for work the next morning and couldn't be reached, her family knew something was wrong. The following day, October 27th, a disturbing discovery confirmed their worst fears. Melissa's vehicle was found abandoned on a remote rural road near Freeport, Illinois. Her cell phone and purse were still inside the car, but there was no sign of Melissa herself. This evidence suggested that Melissa hadn't simply wandered off on her own. It looked more like she had been forcibly taken. Authorities from Illinois and Wisconsin immediately began searching the area with dogs and volunteers, scouring ditches, fields, and wooded patches for any trace of the missing mother. Despite the extensive searches, no sign of Melissa Trumpy was found. With Melissa Trumpy's disappearance looking increasingly suspicious, law enforcement agencies treated the case with urgency. The Carroll County Sheriff's Office in Illinois and Greene County Sheriff's Office in Wisconsin joined forces since Melissa's last known movements straddled the state border. Very quickly, Derek Hammer became the focus of the investigation, even though police initially stopped short of naming him a suspect publicly. He was the last person known to have seen Melissa alive and had a clear motive to harm her since she was poised to testify against him. Sensing the danger, authorities took Hammer into custody almost immediately after Melissa went missing. Apparently, he had warrants outstanding on unrelated charges, despite the fact that he was set to go to trial in October. This move ensured Hammer remained behind bars while investigators worked the missing person case. To this day, Hammer has not been charged in connection with Melissa's case, but investigators in Illinois confirm they're treating her disappearance as a slaying. Despite extensive questioning, Hammer refused to cooperate or provide any helpful information about Melissa's whereabouts. Meanwhile, investigators executed more than 40 search warrants and subpoenas, analyzed cell phone data, and followed up on leads in both states. Over time, the evidence, or lack thereof, pointed toward a grim conclusion, and investigators concluded that Melissa was almost certainly not alive. The primary theory in Melissa Trumpy's disappearance is that she was slain by Derek Hammer on the night of October 26, 2021. It's been theorized that this was possibly to prevent her from testifying against him or leaving him. This theory is supported by his known history of violence and the fact that there was nothing to indicate that Melissa was intending to leave on her own. As of now, however, investigators have not recovered a body or enough hard evidence to charge anyone, which leaves the case unsolved. Another idea is that someone else entirely was involved, perhaps connected to the couple's illicit activities, but no evidence has emerged to support that. Nearly 4 years have passed since Melissa Trumpy disappeared, and her family is still waiting for closure. In 2023, Derek Hammer was convicted on a number of unrelated charges and sentenced to 5 years in prison. During his sentencing hearing, the missing persons case loomed large. A prosecutor acknowledged in court that there is strong evidence Melissa is no longer alive, and Melissa's family gave emotional statements, emphasizing the pain Hammer had caused. Yet, even as Hammer serves time for his other crimes, no one has been held accountable for Melissa's disappearance. Tokyo's Kabukicho district never truly sleeps. But in the neon-lit early hours of September 1st, 2001, a sudden explosion jolted this area into chaos. Within minutes, a narrow, multi-story building was transformed into an inferno, trapping dozens of late-night workers and patrons inside. By the time firefighters extinguished the blaze 5 hours later, 44 people were dead, one of the worst fire disasters in Japan's modern history. Yet this horrific incident, now known as the Myojo 56 building fire, is barely remembered globally, given the events that would overshadow it just 10 days later. Till this day, the authorities believe that this event was an act of arson by a single man who has never been brought to justice. In the heart of Kabukicho, Tokyo's notorious entertainment and red light district, stood the Myojo 56 building, a narrow 4-story structure packed with late-night businesses. Around 1 a.m. on September 1st, 2001, an explosion rocked the building and ignited a fierce fire that tore through its upper floors. The third floor housed the Ikkyu Mahjong Parlor, an illegal high-stakes gambling den, often frequented by off-duty workers and gangsters. The fourth floor was home to a provocatively named club called the Super Loose Hostess Bar. Both floors were crowded with patrons and staff at that late hour. According to witnesses, a fireball ripped through the mahjong parlor when a staff member opened the door, suggesting a sudden backdraft or blast of flames. The explosion even punched a small hole in the building's front facade, and within moments, thick smoke and fire engulfed the top levels of the cramped building. Panic ensued inside as people realized they were trapped. The building had only one narrow staircase and no alternate emergency exit, a disastrous scenario once fire broke out. Some desperate victims fled upward to the roof, hoping for rescue. Others made the split-second decision to jump from the third-floor windows to escape the searing heat and smoke. 3 employees actually leapt out and miraculously survived, though they suffered serious injuries. On the streets below, Shattered glass rained down on fire engines and ambulances as first responders arrived to a scene of mayhem. Bystanders watched in horror and confusion, and some even tried to run back inside to save friends, shouting that people were still trapped upstairs amid the flames. Firefighters battled the blaze into the early morning hours, and it took 5 hours to fully extinguish the fire. When the smoke finally cleared in the early morning, the toll was devastating. A total of 44 people lost their lives inside the Myojo 56 building. Many of the victims were found on the third and fourth floors, overcome by fumes before they could escape. In the immediate aftermath, Tokyo's emergency teams and police swarmed the site to recover bodies and aid any survivors. Most of the 44 victims had succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning from the thick smoke rather than burns. Investigators quickly saw that the building itself played a massive role, with numerous fire code violations coming to light. The stairwell, the only path of escape, was cluttered with storage items and blocked off, hindering evacuation. Automatic fire doors that should have contained smoke and flames were propped open or disabled, allowing poisonous gases to rapidly fill the upper floors. An official investigation later concluded that if those fire doors had closed properly, it would have delayed the spread of deadly smoke by at least 20 minutes. As the city reeled from the disaster, attention turned to accountability. In the weeks following the fire, Japanese media scrutinized the building's owners and management. It soon emerged that the property owner, the Myojo Kosan Group, and the tenant businesses had repeatedly violated fire safety laws. Over the next year, police gathered evidence to charge those responsible for the hazardous conditions. Finally, in February 2003, Tokyo Metropolitan Police arrested 6 individuals connected to the building on charges of negligence resulting in death. Those arrested included 2 Myojo Kosan executives, essentially the landlords, as well as the operators of the mahjong parlor and the hostess bar. Prosecutors argued that their failure to maintain proper fire exits and safety equipment directly contributed to the 44 deaths. Legal proceedings dragged on for years, but by July 2008, a verdict was reached. 5 of the 6 defendants were convicted of negligence for the Kabukicho fire, receiving suspended prison sentences, meaning they avoided actual jail time. The 6th person was completely acquitted, which is much more rare under the Japanese system than it is under our common law system. While the courts addressed the safety lapses, the question of what actually caused the fire continued to hang in the air. Notably, the trial for the fire was simply for the negligent conditions in which the building and premises were kept. Initial reports on what actually caused the fire were inconclusive, and in the immediate aftermath, investigators refused to speculate publicly. Interestingly, early evidence pointed in different directions. For example, a broken gas pipe was reportedly found at the scene, raising the possibility of a gas leak explosion. Indeed, in the first days, some investigators thought a gas explosion might have been to blame, though further analysis ruled that out as the sole cause. By late 2001 and into 2002, authorities were hesitant to declare the blaze an intentional crime without solid proof. Instead, the public narrative focused on the egregious negligence of the building's owners. For a time, officials even suggested that arson was likely not the cause, implying the disaster could have been a tragic accident compounded by unsafe conditions. However, as the investigation progressed, suspicions of arson grew stronger. Rumors swirled almost immediately in Kabukicho's bar rooms and back alleys that the fire had a sinister origin. It didn't escape notice that the blaze started in an illegal gambling parlor, and that organized crime groups were deeply entwined in the local nightlife scene. Police eventually came around to this view as well. In 2008, nearly 7 years after the fire, Tokyo Metropolitan Police made a striking announcement. They had concluded the fire was most likely an act of arson after all, despite their earlier statements to the contrary. This reversal of the official stance came literally a day after the negligence trial ended. This suggests that once the criminal responsibility of the owners had been legally settled, investigators felt freer to acknowledge the possibility of foul play. The case of the Myojo 56 fire thus shifted from a mere safety tragedy to a full-blown unsolved arson case. Yet identifying a culprit proved elusive. No arsonist has ever been arrested or charged, and the case remains unsolved to this day. Police did have at least one interesting lead. Eyewitnesses reported a suspicious man fleeing the scene around the time the fire started. This man was seen emerging from the building's front door amid the chaos, and he appeared to be injured as he vanished into the night. Investigators believed this unidentified injured individual might have been the one who set the blaze, perhaps getting hurt in the process. In fact, he was treated as the prime suspect once arson was suspected, but authorities were never able to track him down. That said, personally, I have to question whether he was someone who simply didn't want it known that he was hanging out in the area. After all, this was a high-stakes gambling parlor with a house of ill repute located right above it that was known to be frequented by wealthy businessmen. Given the context, many in Japan suspect that the fire wasn't a random act, but rather tied to the underworld conflicts of Kabukicho. The illegal mahjong parlor where the fire ignited was reportedly earning the equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars a day in illicit profit. Such operations typically require paying protection money to local yakuza groups in order to operate in peace. If payments aren't made, retaliation can follow. It's known that at least one business in the Myojo 56 building had refused to pay extortion fees to certain crime syndicates, causing trouble with gangsters in the months before the fire. This has led to a theory that the blaze may have been a brutal message, an act of arson as retribution or intimidation by an angry gang. Some have pointed fingers specifically at rival factions jockeying for control in Kabukicho. Around that time, Chinese gangs were also muscling into the district, sometimes clashing with the established Japanese yakuza groups. It's possible the gambling den got caught in a squeeze between competing criminal interests. In one interview, an alleged Chinese gang leader acknowledged knowing the building and admitted there were disputes over it between the Chinese and Japanese organized crime figures. However, he was clear that while it wouldn't have been unusual to torch the building, neither his group or his Japanese rivals would have committed such an act. His reasoning was simple. They're in the game to make money, not to burn down buildings full of people who are ultimately paying money to the criminals. And this makes sense, after all. A large fire would also bring intense police heat on the whole district, which is bad for business. Given the connection to gang activity, it's been speculated that the individual seen fleeing the scene may have been a rogue enforcer. When it was found out what he had done, it's speculated that he may have been handled by his own people to prevent the whole organization from being torn apart. Over 2 decades later, the Myojo 56 fire stands as a haunting mystery in Japan that isn't well known in the outside world. My own personal hypothesis is that the man seen fleeing the scene was indeed affiliated with one of the criminal groups fighting for control of the building. I suspect he may have went there to try to intimidate the business owners into complying with higher protection fees. To do so, he may have lit a small fire, not realizing that there was a broken gas pipe in the poorly maintained building. From there, I suspect he may have been silenced by his own people, or that he simply disappeared, pretending to be a victim of the blaze. Hey everyone, Jimmy reminding you to like and subscribe and tap the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to hit that join button if you want to take your support for my channel to the next level. You can support for as little as $1 a month. In early December 1991, the Austin suburbs were bustling with holiday shoppers. Families crowded strip malls and couples enjoyed nights out. Hidden beneath this festive veneer, a small frozen yogurt shop in North Austin prepared to close for the evening. Two teenage employees, 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison and her friend Eliza Thomas, were tidying up while Jennifer's 15-year-old sister Sarah waited for a ride. 13-year-old Amy Ayers, another friend, was there too. None of them would make it home, and when firefighters responded to a blaze at the I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop, they discovered a scene that would traumatize the city for decades. This incident at this Austin yogurt shop would go on to be one of the nation's most haunting unsolved mysteries until it was recently solved. But despite its recent status update, a pressing question remains, and the authorities continue to search for a second perpetrator. The evening of December 6, 1991 began like many others for the Harbison sisters. Jennifer and Eliza were wrapping up their shift when Sarah arrived, accompanied by her friend Amy. Witnesses later reported seeing men hanging around the strip mall, and a man was observed entering the shop just before closing. Shortly before midnight, a passing patrol officer noticed smoke, and when firefighters arrived, they encountered heavy flames and a pungent odor. Firefighters knew what that smell meant, though the full horror of what had happened was not yet known. As the smoke cleared, they made a gruesome discovery. 4 bodies clustered in the back storage area. Investigators determined that the girls had been bound with pieces of their own clothing, gagged with cloth, subject to illicit assault, and shot in the head with at least 2 different weapons. Their bodies had been doused with a flammable liquid and set alight. Austin police quickly launched an extensive investigation. Dozens of detectives canvassed the area, interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, and gathered physical evidence, including 2 sets of shell casings. Unfortunately, the fire and sprinklers had destroyed much of the evidence. DNA technology was in its infancy, and investigators didn't have the tools that would later become standard. Frustration grew as leads stalled, and in the weeks following the attacks, police released composite sketches of 2 men seen near the yogurt shop. Tips poured in, leading investigators to interview a wide range of individuals, from drifters to disgruntled employees. Among those arrested was a 16-year-old named Maurice Pierce, who was found carrying a weapon at a mall 2 days after the attack. Ballistic tests eventually showed this weapon hadn't been used in the commission of the crime. However, Pierce told police he and 3 friends, Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, and Forrest Wellborn, were all involved. Over the next few years, these 4 men, then teenagers, became the focus of the case. The investigation suffered from tunnel vision and controversial techniques, and in retrospect, the techniques appear to have been designed to get a confession rather than the truth. Detectives interrogated the suspects repeatedly, sometimes for hours without lawyers present. Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen eventually confessed, implicating each other and describing details that some investigators believed only the perpetrators would know. Critics argued the confessions were coerced, and Springsteen had developmental difficulties, and Scott had been threatened by detectives with the big state-sponsored DP. In 1999, a new investigative team revived the case, and all 4 men were arrested. Prosecutors charged Scott and Springsteen with a capital offense, while Pierce and Wellborn faced lesser charges. Springsteen was convicted in 2001 and Scott in 2002, each sentenced to life in prison. From the outset, the convictions were controversial, and defense attorneys argued that the confessions were inconsistent. They also argued that they contradicted physical evidence, and were obtained under duress. Further, there was no DNA linking the men to the crime, and the weapons used in the crime were never recovered from this group. In 2006 and 2007, appellate courts reversed Springsteen's and Scott's convictions, citing improper use of co-defendants' confessions. However, the authorities were still free to bring the case against them again, given the decision on appeal. Further, DNA testing revealed that none of the four men were involved in the indecent assaults that took place on the victims. While this didn't necessarily mean they weren't involved, and there could have been an unknown fifth man, this made the confessions even less logically coherent. Prosecutors ultimately acknowledged they no longer had enough evidence and dropped the charges in 2009. Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen walked free after spending nearly a decade in prison. Maurice Pierce, who maintained his innocence, was eliminated by an Austin police officer during an unrelated altercation in 2010, putting an end to any questions about his role. Forrest Wellborn was never tried for his alleged role in the attack on the girls at the yogurt shop, despite having been initially charged in relation to the events. With the functional exoneration of the original suspects, the case returned to square one. Investigators continued to pursue leads, but the trail grew cold, and in 2017, the Austin cops established a team to get justice for the slain girls. However, the initial hit from this case wouldn't be from genetic genealogy, as some might have suspected, but rather from a shell casing retrieved from the scene. And full disclosure here, when I had someone in the comments tell me that this case had been solved, I immediately thought it was going to solely be due to forensic genetic genealogy. In July 2025, Detective Daniel Jackson resubmitted the casing to the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. Advances in 3D scanning and an expanded database allowed NIBIN to find matches that earlier tests missed. When Jackson's request returned a hit, it linked the Austin casing to an unsolved 1998 double slaying in rural Kentucky. Importantly, that slaying also involved an illicit assault, and there was biological evidence left behind that irrefutably tied the perpetrator to the scene. The Kentucky case involved a very similar weapon, further raising the possibility that the same weapon had been used in Austin. The NIBIN hit was a pivotal moment, and Austin cold case detectives reached out to Kentucky investigators and shared the DNA profile they had. The two jurisdictions shared what they had, and the two profiles matched. In August 2025, a South Carolina state lab located a matching genetic profile in an unsolved 1990 slaying. The match pointed to Robert Eugene Brashers, a serial predator who had been identified through forensic genealogy in 2018. Brashers had reserved his final bullet for himself, and he voluntarily ended his own spree in 1999, leaving behind a trail of unsolved crimes. Interestingly, the ballistic testing on the weapon Brashers used in that last act would later be confirmed to be the one he had used to take some of the victims' lives at the yogurt shop. On September 29, 2025, Austin police held a press conference to announce that they had finally solved the yogurt shop case. Robert Eugene Brashers was born in 1956 and spent much of his life drifting across the American South. He had a history of violence, indecent assaults, and burglary, and was known for his extreme violence. In 1985, he shot his neighbor during a dispute in Alabama, and later, he was linked to several unsolved slayings. As of right now, he is confirmed to have slain at least 7 people, and is believed to be responsible for many other crimes as well. In January 1999, Brashers was arrested in Missouri for unlawful possession of a weapon and was suspected of kidnapping. He was released on bond and fled, but the U.S. Marshals successfully tracked him to a motel in Kennett, Missouri. It was there, during a last stand, that he chose to give himself the DP in that hotel room. Although investigators have identified Robert Brashers as the main perpetrator, questions remain. Police have hinted that at least two men committed the crime, because two different weapons were used, and witnesses reported seeing more than one man near the shop. Brashers may have worked with an accomplice who remains unknown. Some believe that Brashers met the accomplice in the months before the crime. He had previously been stopped by Border Patrol near Del Rio, Texas, just 2 days after the attacks while traveling with an unidentified male. The man's identity has never been confirmed, and it's unclear if there was a DNA profile from the man recovered from the scene. Another question revolves around why Brashers targeted the yogurt shop. Unlike his other crimes, which involved break-ins at private homes, the yogurt shop was a high-risk public space. Some speculate that Brashers and his accomplice intended to rob the shop and then encountered the girls. Others think that the girls were the primary targets, perhaps after being stalked. Brashers has a history of disturbing and illicit violence even outside of this, so it's possible that he may have linked up with another serial predator. Further, the speculation that there may have been more than one offender is supported by logistic considerations. Controlling 4 victims, binding them, and carrying out the horrible acts would have been significantly more difficult for a single person than for 2 men. Personally, I don't find this point to be all that compelling, and I suspect 4 teenage girls who are confronted by one armed man wouldn't be fighting back in any meaningful way. In fact, I suspect this would likely be the case even if these were 4 unarmed, burly, adult males. The full or partial resolution of the yogurt shop slayings illustrates just how far forensic technology has come in the last few decades. Had this crime taken place today, the perpetrator or perpetrators would have been clapped in cuffs within months, given the power of these testing techniques. But perhaps more poignantly, it's unlikely that the 4 innocent victims would have ever met this end at all. Brashers likely wouldn't have been given the opportunity to start his crime spree if he lived in the era of ultra-modern forensic techniques. Anyway, it looks like there's still some significant work to be done on this case by investigators. While it hasn't yet been confirmed that a second perpetrator exists, I hope to have an update on this case shortly.